Hello everyone, this is the Araucast episode 6. I'm Beppe once again starting the conversation, and as always, I'm here joined by Emerald and the Hermit. Hi guys, good evening.
Good evening. Thanks for calling me for another episode. I hope we have a great conversation.
Good evening, everyone. I also hope we have a great conversation. It's a beautiful night today, and I hope you're all fine.
Yeah, and no need to thank anymore, you're basically co-host at this point. Okay, so for today, or tonight, or depending on when you're watching, uh, we're going to address maybe the first more universal theme in this podcast because it deals something that you can find anywhere, right? It's not just about Brazil. I bet most people um, from whatever place, from wherever, from any place in the world would be able to relate somehow to this, which has to do with the reality of urban and rural spheres. When we were discussing which theme to pick for this episode, and decided on this, I started thinking, well, how can I start this conversation? It's a broader theme, and I'm not uh, super knowledgeable on this, but I think I can start by using a personal anecdote. I was born here in my home state. I'm back here in my home state, but I haven't lived here for my entire life. I was born in a little bigger city north of here, and until and was grow up there and grow up there until I was 8. And during this time, I had a lot of contact with my parents' hometown here, and all the all my rel and most of my a lot of my relatives had were still tied to this colonist lifestyle, right? This city started as an Italian colony in Brazil, um, mo- most of mostly of farmers and so on. And during this time, I had some more contact with this rural reality. Up to this day, there are some relatives of mine that uh, work with pigs, or they are cultivating corn and so on. But once I left my home state, because my father was transferred to other cities in Brazil, very far from here actually. Uh, over time, I started experiencing more the lifestyle of more urban locations, right? Bigger cities and more crowded places and so on. And during this time, I started getting more and more detached from this more rural reality of here. And then I look back at all these things that happened, all the places that I visited, all the places that I have lived, all the things that I got to know. You, it's hard to not start wondering, uh, what have I missed in this process, right? Because you get to know a lot of stuff. There, you wonder, whoa, what if I had never left uh, here? What kinds of things I wouldn't know? But you also wonder what kinds of things you missed by not being here. And one of the things that strikes me the most, that I feel the most, is this the lack of knowledge of how things are done in the countryside, right? I almost feel ashamed when I talk with some of my uncles and aunts and other relatives that stay here, because I feel like a lot like the city boy who knows nothing about the real stuff, right? I know a lot, but at the same time, I don't know much. It it makes me think about another anecdote, which is not mine. I probably have talked about this already here because I talk about this every time. It's my favorite anecdote from Olavo de Carvalho. Uh, he was talking about his Jewish. He had a Jewish friend when he was a teenager, and went to his house, played a lot of stuff. And one of those days they were making uh, some kind of picnic. They were eating some snacks after playing around, and the guys the though this his friend's father arrived there and started talking to them. He was an immigrant. He was a recent he was not Brazilian. He was an immigrant, but I believe his friend was already born in Brazil. And started talking with them and asking, "Well, do you know where those things that you're eating come from?" And Olavo at the time said, "No, I know nothing about this." And the father of his friend started explaining, oh, how the all the things they were eating were made, how the cheese were made, how the the jelly was made, how even the forks and spoons and cups were made. He knew about almost anything there, and that struck Olavo, according to him, because he realized that he was not living in reality. That man was living in reality. He knew about stuff. He knew about where things come from, and this is the first aspect of reality that we should know, that we're supposed to know. He even makes he even mentions how that's the reality factor for Marxism, right? Marxism gets that right, that the necessity of knowing how things are done. When you when you don't when you don't have it, you become alienated, right? I believe that's what they call the alienation. When you're too inside a process, when you're a part of such a small segment of a process that you don't know the entire thing, you become alienated. And this is true, but that's not the entirety of reality. It's not what reality is as a whole, right? Most philosophies, that's one thing he says as well. The most ancient philosophies get things right in general, but they may get something wrong, some particular stuff wrong. And modern ideologies, they get some things right, some specific things right, but the entire system is bogus. So you have to recognize those aspects that are true, and you don't have to accept the entire thing. So it makes me think how important that is, right? How you feel detached from the world when you don't know exactly, when you don't even you can't even grasp the material side of things. You can't even grasp the 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 most down to earth stuff. And that's the feeling I had when I interact with uh, relatives that stayed here, because they have a much better knowledge of how things are made. Because everything starts on the rural side, right? The cities are fed by farms and so on. So people from this side of the reality, they tend to know more about the origin of stuff, the material origin of the stuff. And when you look nowadays, the big cities we have, how people live in this urban dimension, they are completely immersed in this urban dimension. They they lack completely this notion of where things come from. And maybe that's the root of a lot of our problems, because when you don't know, when you don't have this notion of where things come from and where they go to, what's the work necessary to create and maintain the civilization they live in, they start believing in a lot of bullshit, right? Like Marxism, ironically. That's the thing that came to my mind at first when you think about the urban rural divide. What do you think about it?
Well, I do agree with you that people, once they start leaving the fields and moving to the cities, begin to lose their relationship with the land. And I think that's a gradual process which suddenly becomes much more pronounced in a movement which I have kind of looked at history and realized that the growth of cities follows a certain pattern. So when early on, both in the lives of cities and of human history, cities were usually tied down to the land, or basically, as Beppe mentioned, cities don't produce food; they eat the food that is produced outside it. So, in general, the size of cities are is confined to the geographical location it is located. So that's why most so-called of the most proeminent ancient civilizations were those founded on river valleys, because those are fertile lands, and the great power of irrigation to greatly boost agricultural yield made for much more permitted a much more sophisticated level of city life. So you have this dichotomy that the city cannot produce food, and is generally a drain on agricultural resources. And on the other side, you have the countryside, which in turn has to feed the city, but is generally striven of its political importance. The city tends to centralize all the political decisions and all the cultural life, while the countryside has to bear the burden of uh, feeding it. So for a lot of human history, that's how this tension lied. The growth of cities was in large part limited to the geographical extent to which it could expand its agricultural yield to permit a larger population. And this problem was quickly solved, or the early intuition was good enough to warrant people to realize what would be needed to surpass those limitations. And the obvious thing, which we all have been pointed out for by Adam Smith, is trade. So a market is only as great as the more markets it can reach. So cities realized that they don't have to exactly rely on agricultural yield and the land that is tied to them, but they can also rely on foreign trade. So you become able to create cities in largely unproductive land, and you sustain those kind of cities by trade. So that's how a lot of big urban centers survived in the pre-industrial era. But once the industrial revolution came about, and which was preceded, of course, by the agricultural revolution, then the city became such a powerhouse once agricultural productivity was high enough, and when the levels of global trade, and people usually think of global trade in the matter of moving spices and of moving, precious goods like furs, gems, gold, and etc. But the so-called mother of all trades, which was what the Dutch called it, the mother of all trades, which the Dutch, which were the greatest commercial power of the pre-industrial era, was the grain trade, was the Baltic grain trade. So it was not spices, it was not gold, it was the grain trade which permitted cities like Amsterdam and London to become greatly more populated than they could ever be, because you are not just allocating the arable land in your country to boost the possibility of expanding your population. You're using the capacity of all the markets you have access to increase your population. So how does that tie down to what we were discussing? This process kind of created a great web of complex relations which allowed cities to become isolated from their dependency on the rural side, and and eventually it led to the idea of urbanization, in which most of the developed world came to live in cities, and it became hugely dependent on foreign trade to sustain itself. So before the Industrial Revolution, Europe was largely self-sufficient on grain. If you think back to the medieval era, for instance, England was seen as kind of like the dream for, fertile lands by people like the Vikings, which were, they wanted better land because they lived on the frozen roof of the world. And the same thing with like Russia, with the Kievan Rus and the Rus coming down from the north, and same thing as France. So all of those places used to be great agricultural producers and have great land. Once the Industrial Revolution came around, they became net importers of food and net exporters of industrial goods, which led to a great development in technology and huge economic growths. But it kind of created another culture, because once you tear down this binding agent that the land has to the cities, you basically strip away uh, part of your culture. Uh, I think we're going to discuss this later on this episode, but the countryside is usually more resistant to social changes. As I have said before, cities tend to concentrate a lot of cultural and political activity, while the rural side is more focused on, the actual material reproduction. So this process of urbanization and of uh, cities becoming less dependent on their surroundings, and more able to reproduce through foreign trade was, I believe, one of the biggest culprits of city life becoming so unattached from cultural and from traditional in general, such as that we are now having to discuss this idea of cosmopolitanism, of people can be at home in whatever city they might be, because city life is such a distinct thing that there becomes this idea that every city is just every man's home.
Well, I'll try to connect something that you both said. Beppe mentioned that the knowledge of basic things that you lose when you are in the city and you are not in touch with the more grounded reality of knowing how things work. And yes, being a city rat makes you give up on this knowledge of basic things, but the market, which Hermit was talking about, free trade and things like that, makes up for it, right? And I think there's a specific type of person for which one, the city, the urban scenario is probably the best. And there are many examples of this, but the first one that comes to mind is um, I don't know if you guys know Thomas Bernhardt, the German I think or Austrian writer. He has a book called The Loser, and he talks about precisely that kind of person because, um, well, precisely because they have the luxury of not dealing with the rural stuff, they can dedicate their lives to the pursuit of their art. So, yes, I think that most artists would win by not having to deal with um, more rural things. In the case of the book, they are musicians, right? So the guy plays the piano, and whenever he's in the countryside, because of the humidity, his piano gets mold or things like that, and he's always dealing. He says, well, he's not always dealing with that. Um, in the book, they're like musicians around Glenn Gould, the famous pianist, and he mentions at times how the humidity is something bad. But anyway, my point is that I don't think the big problem is necessarily not knowing these things, but not knowing these things that I mentioned, like knowing the basic knowledge that Beppe was talking about, but giving up on this knowledge and not making anything with the time and resources you get from giving that up. It's kind of a spiritual problem in a way. You can get detached from this part of reality, but if you don't dedicate yourself to more sensitive ways, like the pursuit of art or something else, that can become a problem, right? And well, yes, like Hermit said, the countryside, it also it started to depend on urban areas to be productive because they would give the grains and wood, and uh, big cities are always demanding these things because people to eat, right? They need to live in places, etc. And I think there's there's a movie. It's based on a book by Ken Kesey. Sometimes a Great Notion. It's a good movie. It has Paul Newman and Henry Fonda. Um, and it's funny because Ken Kesey has two great novels. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is where society kind of makes you crazy, urban society, and sometimes a Great Notion where nature makes you crazy. And in the second, the family is just a bunch of lumberjacks from Oregon, which is a state, a very humid state, very difficult, very rough state, let's say. And nature, the trees, the wood, you see it in the most brutal side. And eventually, this makes the people more and more desensitized to the more human aspects of their own lives. The family gets divided, and they're always working because you know the life of a lumberjack is pretty much work 24/7 and saving money. Uh, and there's politics too. Anyway, so yes, I I think that urban each side of this discussion has its positives and negatives, and I think the United States are a great example because of that. For that, I'm sorry, are a great example for that because in the 20th century, they had two branches of culture that took over the world. Um, two completely different lifestyles created two different cultures that went everywhere. For example, in the US, there have been basically two sides in this cultural tension. In the popular music, the more rural side was represented mostly by country, right? By whites who were either nostalgic for the countryside or reluctant to move from them. And yes, like Hermit said, um, they were more resistant to change, right? And on the other hand, you had the urban one, which was mostly represented by the blues and jazz, uh, mostly by black people who didn't fit into the urban lifestyle. So, in a way, country songs celebrate everyday life, common basic stuff. And the blues were talking about hopping on the next train and moving on and on and on. So, it's a common theme. And one of the greatest ironies is that both of them share a lot of the same background. They originate from, well, almost in the exactly same historical period. There's even this is true, by the way. Robert Johnson, the great blues singer, he was auditioning for the same person who for whom Jimmy Rogers was auditioning for. And Jimmy Rogers is a country legend, right? They couldn't be more different, but they were working with the same person. who, by the way, wasn't famous at all. And so I don't think that the two things, urban and rural, are like I think it's called skew lines in geometry when two lines are not parallel but they never touch each other. Like one is parallel to the z-axis and one to the x-axis. They're never gonna touch each other. I don't think it's like that. Um, I I I think they live somewhat in the same plane. They came from people who were in one way or another marginalized from society, and the ones who didn't have the means to stay in the countryside or the ones who didn't have the opportunities they expected in the cities. So, anyway, my point is that um, it really depends on what people we're talking about. It's a very you can't be detached from something you're really not a part of, And there's also the discussion of degeneration and things like that, which are a whole different topic, which I think is worthy of getting into.
I believe I have put too much emphasis on what you lose when you move to the city in my anecdote, but it cannot be denied the the symbiosis, the great symbiosis there exists between urban and rural dimensions in any civilization, right? In any society, because the city is the triumph of the sedentary lifestyle, right? Man conquer nature and is able to domesticate animals and plants and so on. And in this process, he has some surplus that lets people have different carry on have different careers, so to speak, have different deal with different stuff, right? Have different jobs and so on. And the city grows because of this. You have this. Not everybody needs to be a farmer, and that's a good thing because people start developing new techniques, and that's the civilizational process, right? You accumulate something, and to the point that the next generation, the people that come after you, have a stronger basis to develop further the to develop more and more to create new skills, to create new knowledge, and so on. But it comes to a point, I believe the issue that comes to a point that humanity starts suffering from success, right? When you look at Rome, because you always have to look at Rome, um, in the beginning when Rome was expanding and becoming this new power, this new Mediterranean power, the source of food, for instance, for the Romans was basically in Campania, I think, no, Calabria, sorry, this region in southern Italy, which is very fertile, uh, especially the plains around the city of Capua, and was relatively close. There was this close proximity between Rome and this other Roman colony, which was formerly also, I believe, a Samnite city, whatever. But when it gets too big, when the empire gets big and powerful, Rome cannot rely on that anymore. It cannot rely even on Sicily, which was a breadbasket. It had a 1 million inhabitants, and it depended on a constant shipment of grain from Egypt, right? You can look at this from one side and say, "Oh, look how powerful they are. They managed to take grain shipments from Egypt to feed the city because there's a lot of people there, and not any kind of people. There's a lot of plebeians who don't even work. They just need the bread and circles. There's this traditional donation, right? The grain donation of wheat and bread for people in order to keep them quiet and obedient. But from the other side, you can look at it and see how fragile the system is, how susceptible to crises. What if some usurper takes Egypt, and that happened? You suspend the grain dole, and there's crises everywhere. You have crises in the center of power, and now the rest of the empire, which depends on those those centers of decision, start crumbling and so on. So it's there's out there's this paradox, right? In when you look at the development of civilization, because when you the more you get success, the more you're able to develop your cities and create those extra activities that are not strictly tied to food production and the rural side of the world. But then they become more vulnerable, right? And when you look at our society today, it becomes an even bigger problem because the scale is much more massive. And we even get to a further problem that, as you have said, you lose knowledge, you certain knowledge when you move to the city, but you gain new knowledge. But the big issue for me is that when you start not knowing what you don't know. If you live in a tiny city, you have an urban you perform an urban activity, but you have an idea of what people out there do, with what people in the countryside do. That's still healthy because you understand the mutual dependence between those two spheres. But when you live in a modern urban center, or even Rome at the time, uh, which is so big, which is so engulfing, that you don't even know what people do out there, that you lack the appreciation for this, and that starts feeding the conflict between those two spheres. You talked about Emerald talked about those two cultures in the US, the some urban culture and rural culture, and they're mutually dependent to some extent, but at the same time they are always in conflict because they don't know what each other do, right? You look at the people in the city, look at someone in the countryside, in the Midwest, as a redneck, not in the Midwest, in the Midwest, in deep South, as this redneck Republican who is full of bigotry and so on. You can even realize, okay, but he performs a different activity. Maybe his personality is more fit to what he does, and they cannot conceive this because they are so detached from the parallel, not parallel, from the complementary reality of the rural side, that they cannot appreciate what they do, even though they're different. And when you guy from those regions, from the rural region, from more conservative region, look at the city, they only see those snob intellectuals who do nothing, who nowadays say they're woke and so on, and some to some extent they are, but they cannot see the to what extent the bureaucracy, the administration, the intellectual framework that many of them created um, allows them in the rural side carry carry on with their activities, right? You going back to to Roman times, one thing that is pretty discussed when they look at the late antiquity, quote unquote, uh, especially for the eastern side, the Byzantine Empire, depending on what you want to call it, is how they were harmed by the collapse of cities. Because you have the East managed to survive for a little longer, and but what really struck then was the plague, right? You had the Justinian Reconquista and then the Justinian plague, and plagues affect cities uh, disproportionately, right? Because people are more concentrated, it's easy for sickness to spread and so on, epidemics to spread and so on. So most of the population of the cities have died down, and most of them were Greek-speaking people who managed bureaucracy, were able to were act as those centers of power that the capital in Constantinople managed to project power and so on. And when those cities died down because of a plague, the control, the grasp on the hinterland vanished as well, right? You don't, and that's what through this process most of the empire had collapsed. You have the period of brutal contraction of the empire with the Muslim invasions and so on. So when you look at this, you see there's this complementary relation, and when you have a successful civilization like Western or Westernized ones or industrialized ones like we have today, this success is so big on one side that we face this crisis when people get alienated not only regarding their own activities but regarding the activities of people they depend on, right? And that's that's this situation feeds into this growing conflict and this growing divide that we see nowadays, because people lost the this perspective, right? Not sure if you agree with what I'm saying here, but
Well, there certainly is a tension. I think there is a point in every civilization where, as you guys have talked about, that there are inevitably and quite evidently uh, good aspects to cities and a lot to gain from it, especially by concentrating people on such a small geographic area. You allow for more human interaction, and with that you managed with a bigger market, uh, a bigger networking of people. You allow for more specialization, and with that you allow for more innovation and capital gains and etc. And that's what you call the technical progress of civilization. But as I stated before, the whole existence of cities is predicated on agricultural yield because people need to be fed. So there is this tension in the sense that as more and more people concentrate in cities, the more food they're going to need. But as the the city grows, and it grows in a manner that it gets increasingly more complex in the sense that the more social relations you develop inside cities eventually grows to a point where the social relations are so complex, and work is so specialized and tailored for specific needs inside cities that it becomes very self-referential. And as we are discussing here, they begin to lose sight of the reality of the relation between city and rural life. So city folk tend to get really stuck on their complex social relations. City life is in a lot of ways analogous to court life. You see a lot of emperors or courtiers who get so mad about court politics that they forget about running the country. So that's what a lot of city goes through. And the huge issue for me, or the way I see it, is that given enough time, the need for increasingly more complex social relations uh, makes the city very powerful, very wealthy, but it grows beyond what the land can produce. And inevitably, this leads either to famine or to reliance or on foreign trade. Excuse me. So once you allow foreign trade independency of grains and of food, what happens is what Beppe mentioned on his example of Sicily and Egypt. Uh, what happens is that the survival of a city is no longer tied to the immediate rural reality surrounding the city, and becomes much more intertwined with imperial politics. So life, it goes from a thing which is rooted on your own country, on your own countryside, on your own people who feed you to, to make a great city a marvel to your people. It begins to be away from that, and you begin to be dependent on the via politica, or their political way. And increasingly so, to the point that more and more people begin to believe that their whole subsistence can be acquired via the political way instead of the actual materially produced way. And this is, in a larger sense, the birth of socialism, because it is acquiring subsistence through the political means instead of the material or productive means. Uh, and that's what uh, relates to our idea that city life uh, becomes so uh, unattached from their rural reality and so attached to their own interconnected ways of living and so dependent on foreign uh, supplies to feed itself that it basically becomes an island inside the country and basically a parallel kind of state. And it happened a lot in history. If we think about the city in history, it worked almost like a parallel state in some countries. Uh, in a lot of times, if we think about the free cities of the Holy Roman Empire, if you think about the cities, the own cities of the Roman Empire, they each had their own political life, their own interest, and they frequently clashed with one another. In a more modern sense, as Emerald was talking about, different cities kind of exert this uh, political pressure all over the country. So in the United States, for instance, you have this huge megalopolis, which we call it, on the East Coast, ranging from I probably going to miss it, but from Boston to DC or something like that. This East Coast megacity, and it largely dictates basically the political future of the entire country, while large swaths of i- rural land, which are deeply tied down to generations and generations of America, are forgotten in the name of urban cosmopolitanism, which becomes increasingly more self-referential.
True, I completely agree with the part that this detachment, this with the material reality of things, what needs, what sustains people's lives in the cities, it most of the time is the mother of all uh, socialist thinking, right? When start believing that all your problems can be solved by political will, you get you start having all those crazy ideologies, and that's happened mostly because people lose touch with what's what's needed, right? Or how the world works.
No, no, I was just thinking. That's very interesting. That goes in a very different direction than what I was thinking. But yeah, the examples that I know from the ancient world are mostly from books that I read about other stuff, not necessarily politics. So um, I have a few examples of. I'm trying to remember where Sappho was from. I think it was Lesbos, right? But yeah, these places were big cultural, like culture was booming on them in Egypt, like 500 plus years before Christ. They had very modern cultural ideas, like uh, you know, troubadours in the Middle Ages. They were kind of like that. They were singing about very personal things, and that was unknown back in those times. So yes, there is this cultural boom, but at the same time, I can't see how what you said is not true. Um, this detachment from the most maybe it's because I don't think about this politically, but the detachment from how things are produced clearly creates a gap that is um, hard to deal with. I don't know what to make of it.
It's not just a political thing. When we look at this specialization, coming from a libertarian background, we learned I learned to appreciate things like division of labor and those supply chains and comparative advantages, the efficiency of these, right? Let any each people do what they do the best, and we, in the aggregate, will fulfill our needs much better. But the problem is, and that you can see this at production, you can see this in academia. The problem of specialization is that um, as you start specializing more and more, you get to the point that you know so much about so little that you reach the point that you know everything about nothing, right? And that's a vulnerable position to be. It's a problem of suffering from success when you develop societies develop to the point that there's so much specialization. Everybody's extremely vulnerable, and not only from the survival standpoint, but also from an ideological standpoint. Because if they lack the perspective of things they don't know, if they don't know what they don't know, they become pretty successful to different ideologies. They become materially very vulnerable. It's in many aspects the the success of urban life it's also it's a double-edged sword, right? It can also lead to a collapse of the society when they started uh, they start living in this very fragile equilibrium.
Yeah, I think you're spot on that. Uh, uh, I was trying to say, and I think I can articulate it more clearly, this idea that cities, they kind of have diminishing returns, in a sense that if we think about the natural progression of civilizations, we start as hunter-gatherers, we move on to, some kind of settlement, and you upgrade to a village, and then you become a city, and in the city is where culture itself begins to flourish, where identity becomes organized and religion becomes organized, and you begin to create structures to things which you carried on for a long time in the countryside. The thing is that once the city starts growing, you begin to incorporate more and more elements to city life, and especially as population grows, and the case is even more worrisome if we incorporate different peoples from different parts of the world or of your local area into a single place. You begin to create an environment where you begin to have to work with people from different backgrounds. So let's think about it for a second. When we are in the hunter gatherer situation, every person is with its own tribe. Once you get to the city, how are those different tribes going to collaborate together? By to For this to work, you need systems. Okay, so as the city grows, so the systems go more complex, and when the city goes exponentially, thanks to things like industrialization, modern technology, and especially global trade, uh, the cities become so complex, their maintenance becomes so complex, and the way to coordinate such a disparate coalition of these different peoples with different economic interests, and interests that are so complex and intertwined with each other that it's difficult to rule, you begin to create this very fragile ecosystem. Another thing that happens, we have thought of this in a much more, thinking as a state, but if we think as an individual, the more a city grows and the more complex a city organization gets, the smaller and smaller the individual becomes. I mean, it's pretty self-evident that if you are one individual among 10, you are reasonably important. But if you are one individual in 10 million, you're not that important anymore. Uh, And it also goes for systems. If you are in a simple hierarchy like a household, you can pretty easily find yourself. But once you are in a city, you have hierarchies within hierarchies and relations which are related to something else, which is self-related between various subjects. So increasingly more, the individual becomes more mute in in the cities, and the systems become more pronounced. And I think it is pretty clear that we can make the argument that the city is a great agent of individual dissipation and of de-individualization, whereas the field or the rural society can be much more individualistic or at least more tribalistic, while the city tends to be more, universal and cosmopolitan.
It's a big paradox, right? Because in a city, the more developed it is, more options you have uh, of what to do. So you can say at first, oh, I can exercise my personality much more in a city where there are so many options of things to do. But at the same time, as you said, there's so much people that the results of your actions become irrelevant. So you can exercise your personality, but at the same time, the effects of you doing that become less and less relevant. So you start uh, you lose your individuality, right? You lose the ability of marking that place somehow. And something else that you said, and I agree as well. Yeah, when you look at early stages of urbanization, they consolidate culture, right? You have a community, you have uh, people start having a sedentary life, and when they have those tiny villages, this start concentrating some cultural aspects. Culture starts developing and so on. But when you get a metropolis, when you get a cosmopolitan city where there's people from everywhere in the world or in that region, this center that once was a place where your culture got consolidated and developed, they start being a center of destruction of that culture, right? You can I'll go back to Roman times. When you look at the spread of Christianity, for instance, it started in the cities, right? The term pagan doesn't mean a religion. There's no pagan religion. Pagan was a term used to relate to people from the countryside, right? Those backwards people who still believe those old superstitions, because Christianity was a city phenomenon at first. But it could only spread to Italy, it could only spread to Gaul and Iberia and so on, because it first got to those more cosmopolitan centers. It got to Rome, it got to, I don't know, Colonia Agrippina, it got to Carthage, it got to Carthago Nova. Uh, and through this process, it managed to replace over time the culture of those places, right? You can say that in this case was a good thing if you believe the spread of Christianity was a good thing, but it cannot be denied that the city is the cosmopolitan cities, the cosmopolitan centers are the places where this replacement of culture begin.
No, I absolutely agree. I think in a previous episode I even mentioned the leveling process of the mass man, right? Where everyone becomes kind of everything becomes homogeneous and your individuality, you're afraid to, show some individuality, uh, even though you have the means, right? Like you said, the paradox of having the means in the cities but not doing it. Yeah, I think that's a quintessential urban phenomenon. Degeneration spreads in cities. You become like everyone else because everyone else is like that. I don't disagree with that at all. I think you're both correct.
Yeah, I can compare realities because, as you know, I have lived during 6 years in your city in Brasilia, which is a pretty big one. Uh, and I remember taking buses to go uh, from one place to another, and there was always those masses of people. You always had to run to take the bus, and you were always afraid that you lose it. And all the processes were so quick. You saw how much you were just a cog in the machine, right? If you're not the one taking that van to go to other place, it would be other person. You it's a you feel like a bugman. And here, although I'm as much as I am an antisocial person, you can go anywhere by feet and compliment people in the street, and people will answer you. So you feel much more like you matter, right? You feel much more like you are part of this, that you're alive, that your actions have impact, right? It's a very striking contrast that you can see. But that's a city, as I said, a city where there's not much to do, but anything that you do has much more impact. So there's paradox in our life, right? We look for more possibilities, but when you get more possibilities, what enables those more possibilities in your life is precisely the situation where those options don't matter. It seems like an unsolvable problem.
Yeah, maybe it's because I am from Brasilia, but honestly, or maybe it's a personality thing. I don't know. But I kind of see other people as this is gonna sound really bad, but I kind of see them like pigeons. You know, you just have to move past them in a way. It doesn't exactly bother me. It's just it is what it is. It's one of those things, and yes, probably that's bad. But at the same time, I don't think I. Maybe it's because I never felt. This is very personal, right? I never felt like um, part of a community, so I don't even know what that would be like. But the only people that I actually care about being recognized in a way are are my friends, are the people who are close to me. That's all. I really don't. Again, maybe it's because I'm from the most autistic city in the country, but I don't know. Also, Brazil is kind of a bad example, right? Because everything there is too far away. I don't need to go through all those charades here.
Yeah, but even more crowded urban centers, like I don't know, I know a bit of São Paulo. Even there, it's very uh, impersonal, right?
It's much worse in São Paulo.
Yeah,
Much worse. If you go to the subway, it's like you're a you're an ant in the middle of a you know I forgot the word.
an ant nest.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, but there's this process, as you said, there's so much people that you have to start looking at as pigeons, as ants. You have to desensitize yourself because you cannot handle treating them like people. I remember taking a bus when I was living in another city, which was relatively big, not as big as Brasilia, and looking at the window, all those people at the bus stop and so on. I started wondering, man, each one of those people has a history, right? Each one of them has they're thinking about something. They're pursuing something. They have years and years of history trying to do something, and I simply cannot appreciate that. Imagine if I try to care about people in this level. Imagine if I try to care about the history of each person in a bus stop in a city which has hundreds, thousands of bus stops. It's it's unfeasible. We the only way we can live in such a place is by being less sensitive about this stuff, and at this point then by that process start looking at to people as less human. There's also this aspect I haven't thought about it.
I wouldn't say less human necessarily, but it's just well, everyone no one can care about everything that's in their eyesight, under their sight, you know. I don't really know how every single tool in my house was made, or how everything, how the house was built and things like that. You do know that because you built your house, but I don't.
What I mean is that you start not caring. Imagine if you live in a small town, you understand the divide is pretty clear. I care more about people in this town than I care about people in this other town because it's
Yes.
further away. But when you're where you're in a single city, a single big city where there's people enough to feel there are people they're the equivalent population for I don't know 100 of those small towns. You do not have this divide is not that clear. You don't know who you care about and who you don't care about. So you end up not caring about anyone.
No, I understand that. I was getting to that,
Okay,
but
sorry.
what I mean is that the divide doesn't become the divide between what you care and what you don't care about. It becomes something different than geographical things. It's not your neighborhood anymore, your city or your neighborhood. It's something different. It becomes like a network of things, a network of important people in your life.
Yeah, and the internet kind of potentializes that because I talk with both of you
Absolutely.
guys. I don't even know you personally. You live so far away from here, but it enables those ties that I don't have with anyone here, and I mean that's awesome, but it also sad at some point to some extent, right?
Absolutely, and the internet was great for the chuds in the cities. It was amazing.
Well, I wanted to give a quote here. It's from Stalin. I know it's bad optics to quote Stalin, but
We
he
already mentioned the
said,
mark, so that's
yeah.
that's okay.
I mean, it's a little bit more, in the nose, but uh, he said, one casualty is a tragedy, millions is just statistics. And that's basically how we feel inside cities. And as you guys mentioned, there is a part of the human experience where we are only limited to care about only so much. And it comes naturally for us, which have been conditioned for, I don't know, millions of years of evolution or however long humanity has existence, to live in small, secluded tribal villages and to think about people in terms of family, in terms of acquaintances, and etc. And there is a point, and that's something I thought about as Beppe was talking. There is a kind of a critical mass point or a inflection point in the life cycle of a city in which uh, the the growth of population growth and the capability of agricultural production and the complexity of its systems and the size of its organizations. There's a combination of those factors which, when it reaches a certain point, kind of becomes a critical mass in which the life of ordinary citizens begins to be oriented way less in the ordinary ways of life and start to be allocated to the via politica or the political way. And in that sense emerges Stalin and the 20th century and the industrialized killing of people, and that's the ultimate product of the industrial revolution and the industrial city in the dehumanization of people to such an extent that you commit mass murder. But moving on from that, you also dehumanize people by depriving them of their identity and by erasing their identity in this global mush of a sort of gray goo industrial identity, in which everyone is a Californian and wears the same shirts and listens to the same music. Uh, that's an also a form in which the individual becomes erased in the city. We have talked about uh, how cities are these great centers of culture. They are, uh, and evidently so. Beppe talked about how cities in the beginning are great disposers of cultures and great cultural centers. A lot of our cities are, at least sort of heritage cultural centers. So Jerusalem uh, still holds a lot of symbolic value and a lot of religious value up to this day. You can say Constantinople and Rome also hold that same status and etc. But as I've alluded earlier, there is this critical mass in which the city loses its status as a cultural producer and dispenser and begins to be this kind of agent of dissolution, in which there is this sort of underlying universal city ideology which tends to permeate every city everywhere in history. And there is this great meme, and of course, this is a meme informed show, uh, that there is this kind of circle of, I guess you would call it a circle of empathy, or how far you extend your empathy. It became a huge thing in that, conservatives
Like a
have
heat map.
yeah, I don't think it's a hate map. I think it's a empathy map, or how far you extend your empathy. And conservatives have a more narrower range, and it usually centers around their family and their immediate family and stuff. And tend liberals, they tend to be more on the outer edges of the center. And I have a theory for that. And my theory is, as I have alluded before, is that we have good statistics that shows that cities tend to be more liberal, more socialistic, more cosmopolitan, and the reason for that, first, is the prevalence of the via politica instead of the productive way, but second is that city life depends on such a complex web of dependencies for it to function, that the importance of your immediate family starts to become less paramount than the importance of complex and impersonal systems. Like so, when you are in a small farming village, if your father dies or if your brother dies, there is one less person to, take to the fields. But if you're in a big city, the way you get fed is not by your father working the fields, it's by the ships carrying the grain to make it to port. So it is no longer a familial issue, it's a political issue. You depend on the state, you depend on the merchants. And another thing, your job probably depends on a complex web of foreign companies, of political regulations, and certain kind of goods getting to certain places at certain times. You depend on such unpersonal systems that your empathy starts to become much less personal and much more generalized. And I think it's a something to think about, that a lot of liberal thought can be explained by how people relate to other people in cities, and especially to complex systems in which their livelihood depends on.
Well, as if it wasn't controversial enough to mention Stalin and Marx here, that reminds me of a commentary about Carl Schmitt, who enthusiastically proclaimed that politics is what remains at the bottom of society when all rational solutions for problems vanish, something like it. So it, it it makes me think about it, because in the cities, the bigger cities are, the less rational solutions for problems you have, right? The less consider the less you can reconcile all human divergences, all human conflict. So you always have to resort to politics. You end up having to resort to politics. Yeah, I think it also explains why people in cities are more politicized, and also, as you say correctly, people are as they have this loser relationship with what is closer to them. it's easy to develop these feelings of more uh, care for the far away stuff, right? The more abstract stuff. To compensate for the other mentions, I believe it's Thomas Aquinas, Saint Thomas, that mentioned that love for the entire world cannot be performed in a very vague way. True love, true caring, deep caring can only be performed, can only be manifested for things which are closer to you. And as you start trying to love uh, broader and broader parts of humanity, you kind of dilutes that love to a very vague form of concern for humanity. So people who love humanity, they tend to hate their neighbor, right? Because they have this vague notion of the humanity they love, which is so out there, which is so abstract. They can't even relate this to a physical person, an actual person who lives next to them. So it probably has a lot to do with urban life, precisely because of this depersonalization, if that word exists.
You guys were citing Carl Schmitt, Marx, and Stalin, and now I have to lower the level of the discussion and cite George Carlin. But he said that he loved people as individuals, but he hated them when they became like groups and masses. But yes, I absolutely agree. And what you mentioned, Hermit, really reminds me of, I think it's Hoppe's definition of degeneracy, right? Where it's the kind of behavior that, if generalized, would end up destroying civilization, right?
Yeah, unsustainable behavior, unsustainable generalized behavior.
Yes, that you're. I was about to ask if I was correct.
And thanks to Michael Mellis for that definition, right? Because Hoppe talks about of degeneration in his books, but he never defines it. I I was only able to get a definition when Michael Mellis asked him.
This opens up the topic of degeneration, right? But or degeneracy, which is a whole other can of worms. But I like that definition. I think it's the best one because most people use the term as if as something kind of abstract.
Things I don't like.
Exactly. But this definition also turns degeneracy into a sort um, of sin, as in, I really believe that to some degree everyone is a degenerate in that definition. I mean, I'm pretty antisocial. Um, isn't that like something that, if generalized, would destroy civilization? Uh, you know, so it, it's kind of a social sin. We're all sinners in different ways to some degree, but no one is untainted. Which means I have to accept some degree of degeneracy. It's hard.
I mean, we're all degenerates to some extent because we're all fallen creatures, depending on your worldview, right?
Exactly. That's why I compared it to sin.
Yeah, I assume here a right wing worldview. We have to do an episode on what being right wing means, but in my opinion, it has to do with this fallen nature, right? This this limited view of humankind, of the human being. Okay, but what I mean is that the problem of the degeneracy is when you promote this. Suppose that I'm a lazy person. There are two possibilities. I can either say, oh, I recognize my failures here. I recognize my sins of being lazy, and I don't recommend that you do the same, because if we generalize this behavior, society cannot function. But there's also the other possibility, uh, the more vanity folks one, when they say, "Oh, I cannot be a bad person, so I'll spin things in a way, my rhetoric in a way that the things that I do, my laziness is actually a virtuous thing. And if I spin it as a virtuous thing, I need to promote it. I need to stimulate people to follow the same steps I do, and in that way, I become a nocive, a harmful element of society. I become a degenerate in the Hopian sense.
Exactly. That's why I said that the way that people discuss degeneracy is kind of stupid. Eh, Just like you said, it becomes things I don't like. because if you take it seriously, everyone is to some degree a degenerate, and I mean you have to accept it, which is different from uh, saying it's good.
Yeah, every society has a level of tolerance to this, and it's part of. I mean, it's part of reality. We're not perfect creatures, but as you said, you cannot promoting it is a different affair.
Thinking of degeneracy in a matter related to moral decay, as correct or as incorrect that it might be, I would like to think of it in terms of how important it is for certain societies to enforce moral unity. And I think we can make the case pretty convincingly that in order for tiny societies or tiny communities to work, there needs to be a level, much more greater level of moral agreement than in cities, because cities are much more reliant on systems, while personal connections are much more reliant on character. So the reason that we may experience cities as much more degenerate than rural societies is that uh, uh, cities can afford for a lot more deviancy because they counteract that deviancy through impersonal systems. There is another element, for instance, that, as I have alluded before, in cities, a lot of people can survive through the via politica without actually being productive themselves. So, if you think this in a sense of human survival in the wild, you can't reproduce if you are not productive. Uh, Quite literally, but in the sense that in the wild state, if you can't reproduce your life by means of acquiring food, for instance, you are going to perish. You're not going to pass on your genes. But in cities, as your survival is not dependent on your own work, but on the political will of governors and of trade, you can afford to indulge in a lot of things that may break a little of the social cohesion, but that is not going to affect production of actual production of goods. If you think about tightly knit communities or of a farming village, if one person dissents from the established morality, it's a bigger problem than if one in 100,000 persons in a city does. In that smaller sense, it is a much more greater threat. In the city, not so much. You're just another client of the great patronage system. Uh, and that's why cities allow for unproductive behaviors and antisocial behaviors and uh, degenerate behaviors to proliferate a lot more.
Makes me think on the particular case of Brazil, not super particular, but here is it's very pronounced the problem of public workers, right?
You mean civil service?
Yeah, sorry, civil service. I'm not, I don't have the best vocabulary, but you have this public, the civil servants that are necessary to some extent, but also when you have this kind of system that when you can perform those functions, you can create an opportunity for people who are useless, right? We know it. There are many civil servants that don't do their jobs properly and or don't do them at all, and is mostly focused on cities. You don't have many civil servants on rural side.
Yes, and in Brazil particularly, the dream of some people becomes to get into the civil service market, let's say.
Yeah, they dedicate their entire lives for passing some examination and then have a good salary assured for their entire lives.
Yes, it's bizarre. Uh, but yes, this. my problem with the idea of degeneracy being used in the way, I mean, I agree that there is some kind of behavior that should be completely, um, ostracized. But my problem with the idea of degeneracy in this way is that the term was used in different contexts by different political groups in counterproductive ways. I mean, socialists would use it to attack capitalism because capitalism, makes people degenerate. Or authoritarians would, in general, right, use it to try to identify, I don't know, phenotypes that exposed criminality, or race scientists until the progressive LARPing of the early 20th century. Uh, I mean, they began the eugenics movement, right, in America. And by the way, a book that really goes in depth in a chapter about this is Arthur Herman's The Idea of Decline in Western History. There's a chapter just for degeneracy. Uh, so I think it can be used. The same thing can be used as a justification for very different ideals. If you take, for example, the myth of the damned artist, or of the great man, or things like that. Uh, some people argued that the same degenerates would also be able to become great poets, artists, philosophers. I mean, it's an argument to be made. I don't know if I agree with it, but it exists.
We started with the open definition, but one problem of libertarians, this branch of libertarianism at least, is that this annoying practice of trying to redefine stuff, right? Just instead of just creating a new term, they try to redefine. Oh, degeneracy actually is this, capitalism is actually this, property is actually this. Why do libertarianism itself? It started as a more socialistic movement, right? And people try to redefine stuff, and it creates a lot of issues. It's a very annoying practice. I wish people just created the new terms. But that said, as I said, you can take degeneracy as you can see it with different meanings. When you talk about artists, we talk more about those this chaotic behavior, right? Uh, I agree. Every society has to have a stabilizing force, but also a more creative, creatively destructive force, right? It pushes it forward. Always necessary. Because if it gets too stagnant and super self-referential, you get the problem, you get the Byzantine problem, right? You stay for centuries in the same old-fashioned way, and one of those days you realize that the world is much more developed than you, and you just rot and decay.
Yes, and even politically, as I mentioned, like the same problem that libertarians have. Socialists was used as one way, fascists on another way. Uh, I don't know what traditionalists probably use it in a different way. And yes, I just mentioned the myth of the damned artist as an example of people using the same thing to justify some stuff that may even not be related. But yes, I mean, the possibility of degeneration really is, or can be, stimulating for the right people. Tom Waits, the singer, has a great quote. I should probably find it here. Yeah, he's talking about New York, and he's saying that the surreal situations of the city, like seeing, um, I'm not gonna say the whole quote here because it's kind of big, but he says that seeing people smoking reefer in a church, or partying under a stained glass window, or seeing a blonde travestite getting out of a Mercedes with a cheap wristwatch. He says that these things fracture people a little bit. And quote, I think it's stimulating for artists because if you are visually susceptible to images this optically, it's constantly bombarding you with a lot of information. if you can take of it without becoming a part of it, end quote. So it's like you see it, but you don't get melted into it. You don't become part of the degeneracy. You know, seeing it may stimulate your mind, but taking part of it is too much. You become trapped. And by the way, I have a really fun anecdote. The the Jesus, I forgot. Bach was from the Baroque period. He was kind of a really controversial figure back in his day. I don't know if you guys know this, but his critics at the time hated him. They He was really seen under in a bad light, like not only for his less than saintly personal life, having been in prison, stabbing another musician, having an outrageous sex life with like 30, 20 children, I don't know, multiple women, but precisely because of his art, which nowadays we consider him to be the greatest composer ever, right? But in his own time, he was uh, you know, oh, it's darkened by too much art here. He's trying to be, too vain, too self centered, too focused on his individual experience or transcendence, something like that. But I mean, nowadays, is there a composer who has been more wronged by the people who were, I don't know, demanding him to be less of a degenerate?
Cannot deny the importance of the more uh, disruptive people. It's always a matter of, I believe, a matter of equilibrium. That's actually the point that I think I'm trying to make since the beginning. There's the because this always relates more to urban life, like this kind of degeneracy, this kind of disruptive behavior is more tied to urban life. But it always need the stabilizing force as well. But you have this end up having this problem of representation because we know Bach nowadays because of the impact he had, but we don't know many of his critics, or even people who disliked him and never manifested it. But those people were important to some extent as well. But we don't have the reference for what they did and said anymore. Many of them. So the tendency, one of the problems is that you have a tendency of, as you have more representation for the more disruptive people, we tend to value them more and more. It kind of becomes the only thing that is important. It's important to be disruptive always. And this is a dangerous process. Not sure if I made myself clear, but we, as more disruptive people, more degenerate, quote unquote, people are end up being more represented, end up appearing more. We stop caring about the stabilizing force that's also necessary for a society.
Yes, I agree 100% actually. I think it's when you take one of those two sides of the equation and put it on a pedestal, you are kind of ignoring the whole point. It's an equilibrium, right? But you mentioned something interesting. It reminded me of uh, because you said you were associating this with the more urban thing, but I just remembered the troubadours in the Middle Ages. I don't know much about the Middle Ages, by the way, and I have to ask you, were they more in a when they when they would sing to like royals, like a man singing to a woman from the royalty? Were these people more in a urban scenario?
I think so. It's more of a courtly practice. Because in order to know how to use instruments and compose and so on, you're probably a more educated person already. So that's more tied to the urban centers.
Oh, right. This is a little different because they were from the elite, right? And what the troubadours would make is basically write borderline smut to real women who they were trying to court. Many of them were like teenagers or young adults trying to seduce. women who often, by the way, were married. So it's not just a mass phenomenon. Now that I think about it, I talked about the mass men and things like that, but it can also come from the elite, I guess.
Honestly, I became a little lost in this topic because it has so many ramifications.
Yes, I. This is a very interesting topic. Degeneracy in itself could be a topic for our whole episode.
That's
I
true.
remember what I wanted to say. I wanted to push back a little on the idea that there is a tension, not in the sense that it doesn't exist. It absolutely exists. Uh, I guess I really wanted to think about this idea of a balance between rural and cities, in the sense that, as we have talked about in this episode, one tends to supersede the other more frequently, which is the city, because it tends to accumulate much more power, be it political power, be it cultural power, etc., be it even military might, in the usual way of, centralization. Centralization is a powerful force, but I think, as I have stated before, that there is a kind of critical mass point in which the city becomes just so much more overpowering and disconnected from the rural societies, that it becomes just a thing in itself. It just takes off and joins the ranks of the other cities, and we can think of cities as being basically part of a foreign country, while the urban side is a whole other country in itself. And the lines become much more, much more like front lines in a political, if not military, battle. And I see it not as much as a tension, but or a equilibrium, but more of a rise and fall, or a cycle, in that cities, once they get too, overly complicated, overly complex, overly dependent on international and domestic complex and interweb systems, they eventually falter, and usually either, are completely destroyed, or are greatly reduced, and have to, take a lesson in humility and learn the lessons of the of the rural society, of the great culture that stood for countless years. The cities comes and goes, the field stays the same, the country stays the same. And that's what I wanted to add, because I think we're thinking it a lot more in a sense of a balance, but I think it's much more chaotic. It's in one movement, the city is overshadowing the rural. On the other movement, the city is collapsing, and the grain production has halted. There is a blockade, and the city falls, and the rural takes over. Kind of like the fall of the Roman Empire, where the cities fell into disrepair, and the small lords came to predominance, and etc.
Yeah, most of the feudal system started by those traditional patricians, these Roman elites going back to their latifundiae, and the flocks of plebeians going there and reaching some kind of agreement. Oh, okay, I'll work for you if you let me stay here, because the cities are not safe anymore. The barbarians are at the gates. So you start develop. It's not such an uniform thing. I'm oversimplifying it, but there's one of the processes that happen for the feudal period, right? But regarding the cyclical process, yeah, I can see that, for the simple fact that the relationship between city and countryside is an asymmetric one, right? When you look at people who live in the countryside, and I have seen this personally, there's always that moment that someone there say, "Oh, I need to go to the city because I need to go to a doctor appointment. I need to buy some specific uh, a farm instrument or something. You can only find it in the city. But you can conceive a person not never living who lives in an urban center, in a big urban center, never living. It's hard to think, oh, this guy who lives in a big cosmopolitan city thinking, oh, I need to go to the countryside for some reason. He doesn't. He has everything at his disposal where he lives. When you talk about smaller towns like here, you can conceive sometimes. Well, if I need to buy some kinds of cheese, I know there's a old couple in the more rural area that makes cheese and which tastes better than one I can buy in the market, so I can go there, and it makes sense to go there and get it. But when I if I lived in a much bigger place, when markets are much more complex, if I have a much more variety of cheese, why would I go to the countryside to get cheese, right? So it's a much more asymmetric relationship, and as you said, at some point it tends to collapse. Like, I mean, we to some extent when you look at modern life, I feel like we're always waiting for a collapse that never comes because the system became so complex that it can find ways to maintain itself. Like in, I don't know, we say oh, inflation is rising. Uh, at some point money will lose its value completely and we go back to barter trade. But there people always those bureaucrats, those politicians, always find a way to keep us in this perpetual stagflation, and we live life goes on. So I wonder if we have a new fall of the Roman Empire at some point, or if the
Nothing ever happens.
yeah, or whether fall, we get the fall from or nothing ever happens. We actually vindicate Fukushima and the story's over.
I think he means Fukuyama, not
Yeah, so,
Fukushima, by the
sorry,
way.
sorry, my bad.
Yeah, that's true. I
Fuku,
didn't even
Fuku,
notice.
Fukushima is the power plant. Sorry. Yeah, maybe history will vindicate him.
Yeah, I must admit that I after the degeneration discussion, I got kind of a tunnel vision here. But many anecdotes, I'm remembering many anecdotes. Like, for example, the first original jazz song ever recorded, if I'm not mistaken, I might be wrong on this because memory. I think it's called Funky Butt. That's hardly a subtle title. Like, it's kind of outrageous for some people to imagine that in the 1910s or something, these things were happening. And not many decades later, like in the 30s, there were songs about, you know, cocaine, sex. I mean, few things represent this more degenerate side of culture better, in my view. There's a cartoon by the Fleischer Studios in the early 30s. They are great examples of that. You know, characters like Betty Boop, um, Coco the clown that became famous a few years back. Um, they were not crispy clean. They were like they usually showed some very questionable things in their character, but you know they also had their virtues. In a way that I think they represented something beautiful in the middle of a lot of ugliness, to be honest, the urban ugliness, which of course exists. And for me, that's kind of a redemption. It's a redemption in beauty that makes it the beauty even more powerful. I know it has nothing to do with the more what you were saying, but as I said, I had kind of a tunnel vision moment here.
Yeah, but I can tie it a bit to the discussion about the collapse, the eventual collapse of those systems, because there's a certain correlation between the kind of culture that's produced and the stage of civilization, right? Uh, if I'm not mistaken, Camille Paglia talks about a little about it. When civilization is near its collapse, it becomes a more the culture, the art becomes more, what's the proper term? It's not flamboyant. Is Yeah, it's flamboyant to some extent, but it's more. it's less there's less reverence for things, right? As you say, oh, there's this title for the song which is pretty in your face, it's pretty,
Like transgressive.
yeah, it's more transgressive, more explicit about
Irreverent?
irreverent. That's those are good terms. Those are good adjectives, and it shows how people are losing reverence for things that are important uh, for that society. And when things are starting to bounce back, you can see the reverse process. Look at Rome again. When you look, as far as I understand, when you look at the way people are writing about stuff after the crisis of the third century, when the empire nearly collapsed, it didn't collapse by almost by divine providence, by miracle, by the work of good emperors like Claudius Gothicus and Aurelian, Diocletian as well. Uh, Literature became way more serious, way more moralizing, because to some extent they had gone through a certain collapse. You can argue that the antiquity has ended in the crisis of the third century, not when Rome fell to the Ostrogoths, because there is a complete societal shift. Uh, the way people were producing literature was way more serious, way more moralizing, because they have realized that all that the light-hearted manner that people were carrying out their lives up to that point made them weaker, right? At least I believe was their interpretation. So
My view is that the city, I mean, I think I'm repeating myself a lot, but as a matter of clarification, my belief is that the city begins as a force of cultural expression, of cultural creation and creativity, and eventually evolves or devolves into a entropic force. So in the beginning, or in the beginning of the cycle of the city, it is a productive force. The it centralizes a lot of different markets or of different agricultural producers in one place, and it greatly increases their gain by creating a common marketplace. It reduces the transportation costs. It facilitates the exchange of ideas and technologies and etc. So there is a phase in the development of cities where it is a productive, unitive, cultural, positive force. But eventually, it reaches a certain critical point or a critical mass where it becomes an entropic force and begins to consume everything around it. It starts to exhaust the agricultural production or the agricultural yield much more than the land is capable of, and it also happens that it begins to consume the own culture that the place is based on, and it eventually grows to a more cosmopolitan or a more acultural notion, and it eventually leads way to this kind of cult of decay where people are so disattached to their ancestral traditions or their rural traditions that they become indifferent towards it and actively hostile because they embrace the kind of soul of the city of being this entropic force and of being this great destroyer of cultures and of uh, the dissimulation into this great void of decay.
yeah, one effect of becoming more detached from what is necessary to reach the point that you're on is that you be, you tend to become more cynical, right? I think one of the this more destructive aspects of urban culture is cynicism, because people are so detached, they're so out of touch with reality, they start thinking that everything is fake, right? this cynicism is it tends to be really harmful for it ends up spreading to the complete system. This is something I think I thought
I,
about here.
there is a very famous formulation of this idea in Kafka, what we call Kafkaesque, which is this idea of people being submerged in such a in so many layers of complex bureaucracies and systems that they eventually become alienated and literally alienated, which the meaning is becoming alien, becoming foreign, becoming estranged to the whole system. So there is a what I call a urban pessimism, or you know the stage of civilization or development where the whole thing that made cities great uh, eventually get lost when you are so introduced in a city of indifference of great magnitudes and interdependencies, that you begin to matter less and less. And I think we talked about this. Emerald talked about this in the case of the mass man, and it greatly influences how we interact with our cultural product. Once you begin to be so uh, lost in your own life, essentially, you begin to lose touch with what made life great. And I think that there is no coincidence in the fact that cities are the great birthing places of psychological disorders, because this life so detached from the basic reproduction, the basic processes of human needs, uh, begins to eat at you, begins to destroy your mind, essentially. There is a deep need in each human being to partake in something meaningful. And once you are inserted in this context where seemingly nothing matters because the structures are so much bigger than you, then you begin to fall flat.
What you mentioned about the psychological disorders really lit a light bulb in my head. Um, I think that the problem is that most people who are in the cities are kind of risk averse, but they are in an environment that is not for risk averse people. Um, Risk averse people should be in a more predictable life, which is more easily reachable in rural scenarios, like in the countryside. Um, John Rawls, right? He argues that it's better for people to be born in a world where there's equal chances of being successful or something close to that. And that's a very, risk averse view of life. I mean, which, by the way, contributes for it to be popular in academia, because let's face it, academia is the lair of most parasitic monsters who would sacrifice their own children for stability. But I mean, some people are okay with risk, and they would prefer to take a shot and throw the red dice in the on the green felt. They would prefer this. So, fighting urbanization because of this disconnection, or even the degeneration, maybe, is kind of a Rawlsian ideal. But I really believe that mm, it's easy to be more wholesome in a means that stimulates this. Let's assume that rural means necessarily stimulate that, just for the sake of argument. But in my personal view, and I can perfectly understand that it's not for everyone's taste, is it turns the beauty into something less impressive. When you make something beautiful in a means that it's kind of like that Tom Waits quote. It's very unwholesome. It becomes more meaningful in my views. And myself, I am a somewhat risk averse person, but most people that I admire, not all, that's true, not all, they tend to be the opposite in a way. They saw the status quo that they didn't like and they fought it. Even wasn't that what Rothbard did, for example? I don't know, man. Just anyway, I went longer than I wanted to, but it was very interesting what you said.
I would just challenge the idea that, I mean, in some aspects, rural life, it is more risky. It has a slower pace generally, but there are always this constant tension. When you look at the history of some farmers or uh, cattle producers and so on, they are always in the state of constant tension for the next payment, right? There's some I understand the urban life's more chaotic, is more dynamic, but you have those systems set up. You can have you can be a wage uh
A wage
a,
slave.
a wage slave, a wage laborer. There's this regularity. When you look at the life in the countryside, there's nothing as a vacation. Maybe you can take some days off, but you can never leave it alone. You can never leave your property alone. If in a certain year there was some different harsh climate conditions and your most that you produced was lost, there's no way to recover this properly. You always live in this constant tension. That it has a slower pace. You don't need to deal with the dynamism of the urban centers, but there always this almost a Lovecraftian terror. There's something lying there. There's something above your head that always making you worry about the future. So in some aspects, I consider it more risky. You have to be more tolerant to risk to live a rural life.
You are absolutely correct. I stand corrected.
I think there is a reason why country people tend to be more religious also because in the country, in the agricultural production, you are basically giving in to the idea that a lot of things to which your life depends on are basically on the God's command. So if you have rain, you're going to get fed. If it doesn't rain for your month, your whole family is probably going to die. I mean, I'm using extreme examples here, but the point stands. You are understanding that there are things to which your life depends upon, to which you have no control over, and that tends to lead people to believe or to be more religious in the sense that God is also a force to which you can't control it. He's God, but your life certainly depends upon him. And that there's the people are more accustomed to this psychological idea. On the other hand, in cities, there is this belief that human systems can basically solve everything, and that's probably why they are more atheistic. Because if a harvest fails on a city, they can import more food, they can use their stockpiles, they can move some crates around, and okay, the politicians are going to take care of it, the bureaucrats, the scientists, the specialists, etc., etc. So there is this faith not in God or in the forces of nature or in process that are way beyond your human capabilities, but instead in cities you are dependent upon political means, so you're putting faith in political systems instead of God, which inevitably fails and leads people to the dark roads of depressions and of unbelief and of nihilism and etc.
I want to reformulate what I said. What you said, Beppe, is completely true. But there's another thing: comparative risk. Um, on the countryside, your comparative risk is, compared to other people, it's the same. They are going through the same risk as you are. So there's this unity. But in urban scenarios, it's not that. It's you are the person who is responsible for your, your scaling or downfall
It's a
on
more
the
dog eat dog scenario, right?
exactly. And so, yeah, maybe not risk averse is the right term, but something like comparative risk uh, averse. uh, but I still think that the idea of equal chances of being successful, right? The Rawlsian thing is for very people who are averse to this kind of risk, and the idea of equal chances is much closer, or equal or similar chances of being successful are much closer to the rural scenario, because even if the chances are low, even if the risk is big, it's everyone is in it together,
Fair enough. Yeah, when you share risks, there you can also have a bigger sense of community as well, right? If everybody has the same problems.
Yeah, but some people want to take a higher risk and try to, I don't want to say be great, because it sounds like the people who don't take risks aren't great, but that's not the point. They don't want to be the same. Some people are like this. It's just a fact.
Yeah, the city is a place you go to when you wish to go up the ranks, right?
Indeed.
Okay, as we're approaching here 2 hours of episode, there's some extra point I need to talk about is on the issue of collapse, this the eventual crisis of this urban rural relationship, as the hermit have mentioned sometimes, that cities keep growing up, keep demanding more and more resources, and at some point, if something destabilizes the system, it can collapse pretty badly. And it makes me wonder: is there a way to prevent that? Is there a way to stop that? I remember a post from Aristocratic Fury, a profile on Twitter, or X, formerly known as Twitter. I think his handle is at Lansknecht Pike, and he say, "Oh, in my opinion, cities cannot have more than uh 50,000, 15,000 people." No, yeah, that's the number. And I kind of agree with this, because that's the dimension of a city. Even less than that would be ideal. That's the dimension of a city where we still can maintain this closer relationship to the countryside. But at the same time, it's a bit unrealistic, right? Oh, who is going to determine this the maximum size of a city? The authorities, right? The government, but it resides in the city. So you will you trust the city to limit itself? It's a bit hard to believe that. You have to be a very uh self-conscious kind of government to maintain a city at a certain size. Oh, if we grow past that, we have to create a new one, like Greek colonies, right? Oh, city became too big. Send those people to another part of the world to found a new one. That's not super common nowadays. Or maybe that's not even that would be enough to prevent the collapse. It's just a matter of accepting the cycles and enjoy the decline.
Yeah, I don't think the collapse can be prevented, but I don't think it has to be as catastrophic as it could be. I see it in the same way one could see, for example, the fluctuations of the market. There are some sort of natural market fluctuations in which individuals naturally make mistakes on their assumptions about the future, and inevitably leads to moments where those beliefs are wrong, because they are only human. And the same happens in cities. Cities have a sort of natural cap from how much they can grow based on the resources of the land. And when it grows way past that, it begins to be dependent on trade. And when trade falters, that typically is when cities falter. It could also happen through other means, be it cultural collapse, be it military invasion, plague, etc. There are plenty of, destructive agents which can reduce the population of a city to a degree to which its own ecosystem could sustain it. So the great thing is not avoiding the collapse, because if you are past the point of no return, I don't that literally is no coming back. Is you're just bracing for the fall, and some people brace for the fall gallantly, and some others break their faces. So I think that's the point we're at.
Well, when I talked in a previous episode about hope, I was talking about a very individual thing. Like, yes, the world may be going insane, but it's not something, deterministic for an individual, in an individual level. I really don't think the masses are as determinant or as powerful as most people do. I think that they can be used as a tool, and I think that the individuals that you know the great individuals that these urban centers or whatever constantly, not constantly, but often at times, uh, it gives us. They constantly remind me that it's like very, something very individual, very. They're not determined by the means they are immersed in. I mean, yes, cities have all these problems. I would never deny that, but just like the wholesomeness I mentioned before, when you find something like this in a context that is completely against it, it kind of becomes more beautiful for my eyes, at least. So yes, I totally see all of these problems, but I I really cannot see how that would obfuscate the when someone stands out,
Yeah, I don't think great men are ever going to be erased from history. Quite the opposite. In fact, I think great men are going to consistently be existent into the future. What I think is that uh, great men can only do so much given their circumstances, and what makes them great men is how much they can do given so dire their circumstances. So maybe some ordinary act for us wouldn't be so daring, but given the right situation, it might be. So yeah, I think there is plenty of room for individual action in the future. I just don't think individuals can be the deciding factor to ward off all the necessary corrections of their systems, but they really could make some creative uses of what they will have at their disposal, not to prevent the collapse, but to bring interesting things out of it.
or create alternatives.
Yeah.
Makes me think of another Roman reference of Heraclius and Aurelian. Both tried to save the empire, but only Heraclius was fighting a losing battle. Both of them are truly important, but uh, you have to understand the circumstances to judge them.
You can only do so much.
Yeah. I just want to address when you look at this, when you start looking at this, having this perspective of the eventual rise and fall of societies and civilizations and so on, there's always this temptation of, in certain circles, right, of thinking, oh, let me just move to a remote location and live a peaceful life. I think I have addressed this as well in the last episode. There's this tendency we see nowadays of people thinking like that, but putting aside the problem of LARPing, that many people talk about it, but they never make it happen. There's the danger of the anti-civilizational ideology behind it, right? Because if you think if you reject the parts of civilization that can fall, you also reject the ones which can thrive, right? You end up in this parochial way of thinking that you lose sight of the entire world. I'm not talking about being a ruthless cosmopolitan, like even from your more local reality, it's great. It's good to have an idea of how big the world is and how different it is from your place. And when it's pretty dangerous when people start adopting this idea of living in a farm. That was the meme. You just want to live in a farm and redacted an 18-year-old row. But it's really dangerous when people do this because they stop caring about what makes civilization great as well. As I said, cities are more prone to fail. They are more vulnerable to crisis. But that's also the place when more elevated things can be done. So we cannot refrain from the less safe aspects of our society just to get a feeling of safety, because safety is never assured. And when you run away from certain risks, you're probably just hasten your problems.
Yeah, the idea or the framework of cyclical rise and collapse is to make you not proud, to curtail your pride. It's not an excuse for you to be lazy or spineless and not be able to stand up for anything other than yourself.
Yeah, you fight for what you have to fight, but mm, always with being conscious that it cannot be lost, and you have to be ready to start again. Yeah, I think that's it. Was a relatively lengthier episode, but I think it has. I mean, this topic has lots of ramifications that it can even result in much more episodes addressing more specific points. But it was pretty insightful, I believe, and as always, I wish to thank again Emerald and Hermit for participating and giving their insights. If you guys want to make some final considerations, I leave the stage to you.
Sure. Well, I'd like to thank you. This conversation was very interesting. As usual, some points of view that I hadn't considered were mentioned here, and some ways of talking about the subjects that I never considered more seriously. And well, I used a lot of musical examples in this episode because of a great book that I would like to suggest to anyone who's interested. And I understand it's not for everyone, but it's called Music: A Subversive History by Ted Gioia, um, Joia. He's a jazz historian, and he's a very interesting guy. I'll say that. He's a Girardian, by the way. Um, and I my idea in this episode was kind of to express a point of view that goes against the trad guys from the internet, which we all hate. Well, not hate, but you know what I mean.
Maybe they have the heart in the right place, but they're pretty misguided.
Exactly. And I think they should engage more with culture, even culture that they don't like, the aesthetics that they don't like, because as you mentioned, if they close themselves, they'll become the Byzantine Empire, right? And
Yeah, and one of those days they'll notice the Crusaders are at the door. It's 12:04.
exactly, yeah. And in the book, Joya says that cities that had ports were big cultural centers because precisely because many different cultures were getting contact, and that's very stimulating. And even their own culture would spread more this way, right? And it's amazing kind of what happens in in times that we wouldn't even think about, like in Egypt, as I mentioned, that they found papyrus with lyrics that they weren't necessarily scandalous like a lot of the Babylonian rites. I mean, the rites were insane. Like holy prostitutes would sing songs about the emperor blowing their vulvas or something. And I'm not joking, by the way. But I mean, these guys from Egypt, they would sing things about very individual sentiments and very sensitive stuff. Songs about love, beauty, personal experiences, people they knew. And I believe that the worst thing that can happen to a person is to go through life um, a- as if they're going through a string of facts that they take no part in. Just letting life pass before their eyes. And I think that urban life, and that's something that threat people don't get at all. Uh, Urban life is a big gamble on that. Yes, of course you can destroy your life more easily in an urban scenario, but you can also win big. And I think people should really take this idea seriously, man. I mean, are you? We were talking about risk. If you are someone who is okay with risk, maybe that's for you. It's a very, very interesting subject. I'm very, very interested in it, and yeah, I'll stop there, or else we'll have more, half an hour more.
So good.
Yeah, I would like to thank both of you for the very interesting conversation. I think we had a great episode. We've managed to tie a lot of human history in a very concise 2 hours. I think we covered, I mean, more than 2,000 years of human history, going through a lot of the developments of how cities relate to, our experience, our human experience. That there is a kind of a call to action in this video, which if you are going to take anything from it, you should take that you have to do the best with the situations that are given to you. And if we are in the life cycles of a civilization or of a city in which we are on the decline or nearing the collapse, it should in no possible way be to you a discouragement of action. On quite the opposite, you should be actively working to create something that will endure the test of time or that would endure even a collapse. The great lesson is that nothing is forever, okay? Especially cities. Cities are something very fragile, but that cannot be worked out to produce great things. So whether you are in a third world shithole or not, whether you are in a first world immigrant invaded city, or even if you are in a very pleasant city. I don't know if we have viewers from Singapore or whatnot. uh, you have to make the best out of it while it lasts. It's a precious bar of chocolate. It's gonna run out eventually, but make of it what you will.
Well said. Never doom on. Even crises are opportunities. Okay. Once again, I want to thank you guys and thank the audience for listening to us throughout this episode. And also another thing, I don't want to be asking for this a lot, but if you find what you're doing here interesting, if you like what you're doing, you liking what you're trying to do, uh, you know, do the thing, like and subscribe. I think it helps us with reach and so on. I have I don't have at this point huge ambitions to monetize the channel and so on, but making the message be spread more is it it's always nice. So that's it. Help us if you will, and thanks for listening. Until next time, guys.